Are you taping, baby? Baby, are you taping? Oh, yeah. Hey, 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 hey. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Baby, come on.
Still, after 30 or 35 years, he brings up his rookie year going into former teammates' room and seeing coke and weed and women. My point is, why in the hell did he want to bring that up? What's that got to do with anything? I mean, if you want to call somebody a snitch, that's a damn snitch right there. When that so-called documentary is about one person, basically, and he has the last word on what's going to be put out there. What's going to be put out there? It's not a documentary. It's his narrative of what happened in the last quote-unquote dance. But, you know, we know who was there as teammates that about 90% of it was, I don't know if I can say it on air, but BS in terms of the realness of it.
What's happening, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome to Names Are Not Important. I am Mac and he is free, and that was Horace Grant giving us the lowdown for showdown about how he felt about Michael Jordan following The Last Dance. But I want to bring him in. My man B Free is with me. Free, you heard all that, man?
I heard it, understood it, and I got it clear.
Oh my God.
Right.
So for those of you who obviously had your heads under a rock, if you don't know anything about what we're talking about for the last couple of weeks, Michael Jordan, dig this, had a 5-week series that aired on ESPN since mid-April. It was awesome. We all tuned in for it. I believe in a different climate. We were in our old normal. I think we all would have still been clamoring for something like this because we've been waiting for the Michael Jordan story to come out. We got Jordan Rise the Bus. We all know that wasn't a good Michael Jordan story to be telling, so nobody really cared much about that. But we talked about what he had to endure and how that would play out, and it's been a very awesome series if your head's been in the sand. And what happened as a result of that is it brought up a lot of old feelings across Michael Jordan's contemporaries during that era, and one of them is a guy who played with him in Horace Grant, who was saying very clearly, hey, look, Michael Jordan called me a snitch. I don't particularly like that, and he's referring to items that were getting into the media's hands during the time for which he himself, Horace Grant, was very close with Stan Smith. Stan Smith was a beat writer, I believe, for the Chicago Times, and was also working on a book. He had actually written a book about Michael Jordan itself, and I think he wrote that book with Jordan, and they were wondering where it was getting out, and Michael Jordan claimed very clearly in the series that it was Horace that was telling on him, and Horace is like, hey, look, you the one that came on the series, started talking about the cocaine circus, not me. Like, that's more of being a snitch. And less about him being a snitch and more about this being a very biased documentary for Michael Jordan. I think he's on to something there. Well, we can dissect more of what he said. What do you think, Free?
Well, I think Horace is very correct because now let me say this because I don't want us to seem naive to the fact that we know in film and culture you have to draw out emotion and have that flair for the dramatic. But
right.
In essence, when you look at, because Horace wasn't the first to speak to that. We know Craig Hodges spoke to it first.
Craig went in early.
Yeah, and when you look to Mike being one that's calling out Horace on a snitch, yeah, he's a snitch. And then you look at it within all sports, and especially in those times, what happened in the locker room stays in the locker room. For Mike to be going into, as Craig called him out and Horace called him out, talking about individuals and their habits and what was going on, I think
Absolutely.
broke a certain code. So it's like, Mike, are why are you doing this for the cameras and bringing up something that, like Craig Hodges put it, now guys are going to have to answer to and deal with in their homes with their children or whatever, if they know that, they were on this team and a part of this time. And just like Horace also highlighted the incident with Scotty when he didn't go in the game. And like Horace said, why does that make it in, Mike? Why do you use that to build your point and portray Scotty in that way when that's something you weren't even a part of at the time? And we settled all that. And I think that's where, I guess, television, entertainment kind of crosses the line. That's a fine line because, like we often see when people do tell all books, some people say, well, they kind of
Absolutely.
that or do that. So I think Horace is right in the sense of like, look at what you're doing for the sake of selling this drama series or whatever. But
Absolutely. And I want to go back to what you just said because that's where Horace Grant has the legitimate beef is if we're not reminded that Scottie Pippen sat out for a few seconds, the last couple of seconds, the last 1.7 seconds of that game in the playoffs, and Tony Kukoc made that shot. Like, we don't care. Like, that didn't seem like a significant. I'm glad the story was told. Let me start there. But for the purposes of The Last Dance, it didn't seem like that significant of an item to be placed in. Now, if it's placed in, would it be great to tell that part of the story? Absolutely. Would it be 100% necessary? No. And if you go back and you look at it, if you watch this series to make sure, like, okay, I want to be able to frame everybody in the right light, then this is one of those items that you go back and go, nah, let's take that out. Because I wasn't a part of that. I can't speak to that. That has very little to do with 1998, which is what, for most people who don't understand this is what this series was about. What they had to endure in 1998 as a team. Now, if this were more of the Bulls story, then I think all of it needs to go in. But this wasn't a Bulls story. This is a Michael Jordan from his perspective coming into it. And it's almost as if he wanted to throw a dash of, because for one, I don't think that this was made by accident or if it was some sort of coincidence. LeBron James came back and beat the 73-9 Golden State Warriors, which if people, and I'll say this out loud so everybody can hear it, if you do not remember, the Golden State Warriors were down 3-1 to the Oklahoma City Thunder, and they came back and won that series. So Golden State didn't look like they were the 73-9 team that people thought they were, being down 3-1. Then they came back and won that series, and it was like, that ratcheted back up. Maybe they are the great team that we thought they were, and then they were up 3-1 and had been come back on by the Cleveland Cavaliers, led by LeBron James, who led everybody in everything. And then after that series, because he led everybody with everything in every single statistical category and being the only player in NBA history to do that in the playoffs or finals, this was then brought to the forefront of, let's go ahead and do it. And I brought all that up to say this. I'm sure Mike wanted to remind people of who I am. Let me just quickly remind you of who I am. So, let's go ahead and do this. But because this wasn't a Chicago Bulls feature, and this was more of a Michael Jordan feature, that part about Scottie Pippen could have been left out. Honestly, the part about the cocaine circus could have been left out. But even that it was all good TV at the end of the day. Personally, I'm glad it's in there. But the question for us is, was Horace's beef legitimate? And to me, I say yes. And it sounds like you're saying yes too.
It was very legitimate. And once again, and let's not also forget that in the spin of this, you look at who were the focal points of the documentary. Now, granted, we're talking about the 97-98 team. So Horace wouldn't have been a focal point. Greg Hodges wasn't with the team then. So he wouldn't have been a focal point. But a lot of them still had, I think Horace had some criticism about how it mainly focused on Mike and Steve Kerr. And as we saw the piece on how Steve Kerr lost his father, so they brought that sentimental human aspect into it. So I don't think that was purposely done, but I do want to bring to light that even though they weren't a part of the team, and individuals like Craig Hodges, and some even said, why wasn't Karl Malone interviewed or whatever for it? I would have liked to seen some other individuals a part of it to get their takes. They weren't a part for whatever reason, but I do want to bring that to light because that kind of echoes maybe the control factor and who is telling in this story what, to Horace's point of, I guess he has the control, being Mike, of what gets said last and that. So I feel him in all corners of this argument.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting that people talk about Karl Malone not being interviewed, and I don't have that interview queued up, and I wish I had been thinking about it. So I could have had it queued, but Karl Malone did get interviewed about this, and it was before The Last Dance came out, and he was asked the questions, and to be honest with you, Karl Malone gave what I considered to be a man's answer, because again, I don't care, and I won't say any names, but there have been plenty of guys who are touted out, and I'm just talking about in the name of Greensboro, North Carolina, guys who were touted out as these great basketball players for whom which I can safely say I've had the pleasure of playing with all of them in some capacity, either with or against. And there's some of these cats that they tout out there that I'm like, hey, that dude wasn't that good. And a large part of that is I have my own ego. Like, yeah, I played with him, and that was nothing shocking about what he did on the floor. Like, why do y'all keep talking about him in that light? And Karl Malone gives that kind of an answer, which is, and one of the things that he actually said in that interview was, it wasn't just Michael Jordan, by the way. Like, he was like, when we came into that series, John Stockton said it too, we came into that series, we're worried about the Bulls. We weren't worried about Michael Jordan because we know he can't do it by himself. But he was saying what he did is, and that's what this series should have done for most people, in my opinion, and that's what we're transitioning to now, is the aftermath and aftershock of The Last Dance and how the world is being reminded of Michael Jordan. And I think one of the things that should be a key takeaway from this series is that it was more than Mike that he did some great things and he reminded us of why he was awesome, but it didn't elevate his legend to me. Did it do? But let me go back to what Karl Malone said, because what he essentially said was this, before I ask you that question, is we had to deal with more than Michael Jordan, and I give all the respect in the world to Michael Jordan, but I'm a bad SOB also. And I was like, you know what? That's the answer most of these NBA players who did play in the Jordan era should be saying. We should hear more of that, not more of how he wasn't human and how he could sky, and it's too much of that. Like it's like an overload of adulation for Michael Jordan that's coming from players who played in the league. And I watched this thinking to myself, like, hey, other than Reggie Miller, John Stockton, and a couple other people,